Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith, and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961, and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this spring, both virtually and in store. And also follow us on Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of tonight's featured book available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things, and I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Tonight I have the very great honor of introducing Daniel Tam-Claiborne and Aube Lescure, here to discuss and honor the release of Transplants, a poignant and moving novel about migration and belonging that follows two young women who yearn to survive in a world that doesn't know exactly where either of them belong. Daniel Tam-Claiborne is a multiracial writer, multimedia producer, and nonprofit director. He is the author of the short story collection What Never Leaves, and his writing has appeared in Catapult, Lit Pub, Off Assignment, The Rumpus, HuffPost, and elsewhere. A 2022 National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellow, he has also received support from the U.S. Fulbright Program, Kundiman Sewanee Writers Conference, the New York State Summer Writers Institute, and others. Daniel holds degrees from Oberlin College, Yale University, and the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. Born and raised in Brooklyn, he now lives with his wife and daughter in Seattle. And tonight's moderator, Aube Lescure, is a French-Chinese-American writer. She grew up between Provence, northern China, and Shanghai, and graduated from Yale University in 2015. She's the co-author and translator of 2 books on Chinese politics and economics, and her debut novel, River East, River West, was published in 2024. It has since been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Maya Angelou Book Award, and the Stanford Fiction with a Sense of Place Award, among others. Her writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Granta, Guernica, Lit Hub, Electric Literature, The Millions, and more. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation. Now, Daniel and Aube.
Thank you so much, Pierce. Thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate the enormous hospitality and generosity of being able to come visit Boston, a city that I love so dearly, and to be in conversation with. I honestly love Boston. It's not my fault my partner will never move here. But no, truly, it's so wonderful to see some familiar and some new faces, and most of all to be in conversation with a dear friend who I've actually never met in person before. So this is an incredible honor. Thank you so much, Aube, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for bringing us all together. We'll give you a very warm Boston welcome. And we will start off this conversation with a reading from your book, right?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the novel, as Pierce mentioned, is a coming-of-age story following 2 women. The Chinese-American woman is named Liz, who comes to China to teach at a rural university, trying to kind of get a sense of her roots and also to grieve her mother, who's recently passed away. The other point of view character is Lynn, who's a Chinese student who recently enrolled at the university where Liz is teaching. So I'm just going to read a little bit from Lynn's perspective. This is actually about halfway through the book. Through a series of happenings, Lynn ends up going to Ohio to study at a community college outside of Cleveland. And so this is her first time leaving China. And so I'll just read just a couple pages from that section. For 14 hours, Lynn couldn't sleep. She slumped against the hard armrest by the window, heaved the scratchy blue blanket up to her neck. The pressure in the cabin made her ears ache. She feared that if she ate or drank anything, it would upset her already iffy stomach. She was too embarrassed to ask to leave her seat, let alone attempt the Tai Chi Chuan her mother insisted would promote proper blood circulation. Whenever Lynn closed her eyes, she saw visions play out on the underside of her eyelids. Plane propeller malfunctioning, tail catching fire, crew and passengers strapping on oxygen masks like patients admitted to a ward. But with her eyes open, Lynn saw her surroundings in a different light. She sneaked glances through the plastic shutter, staring at the dark mass moving just beyond her reach. The sky looked as limitless as the ocean, clouds like tiny swells of tide covered in fog. For the first time in months, she was above something, charting her own path, Whatever had happened up until then wasn't the least bit important. She was moving to a place where no one knew the slightest thing about her past. Lynn transferred planes in Detroit, a city so free of her preconceptions that she initially mistook it for Cleveland. The baggage claim felt like a fever dream, carpeted floors and cinder block columns in all directions until, finally, she was ushered into a great hall bathed in white. The man at customs stamped her passport after only barely glancing down and, much to Lynn's relief, let her pass without asking a single question. Lynn spotted Phil first. Sorry, I should mention, Phil is Liz's brother who she's staying with in Cleveland. Lynn spotted Phil first. Outside of the baggage carousel, he was dressed in khaki pants, wool coat, a burgundy scarf. He was the male version of Liz, thin eyebrows, widow's peak, but with a heft to his midsection, and high cheekbones that gave him the impression of someone perpetually pleased with himself. "You must be Lynn," he said, extending a stiff hand. "Welcome to the promised land." Lynn nodded weakly, still too overwhelmed to speak. She couldn't get over the shock of seeing hundreds of people around her and hearing only English come out. "You must be starving," Phil said, as Lynn stepped up into the cab of his station wagon. The air was so crisp it made Lynn's eyes water. Phil switched on the ignition and the car lurched to life like a startled animal. The lanes on the highway multiplied, 2 to 4, then 8, unfolding like a paper fan. In the Costco parking lot in Avon, the grid of vehicles looked vast enough to be its own city. All her life, Lynn was used to having just as much as she needed. She never wanted for warm clothing or school supplies, or worried about going to sleep hungry. And yet, once inside, she found it hard to grasp the abundance. Aluminum cans as wide as her thigh, prawns enough to have depleted an estuary, aisles that she could lie lengthwise in, and still not reach the ends of. "Free samples are over there," Phil said, motioning with his finger. "Eat as much as you want." Lynn rubbed her eyes, staring dizzily at rows of boxes and bottles lit with fluorescent lighting. She barely averted a couple pushing a shopping cart large enough to pile it. Compared to the markets back home, the scale of choice was paralyzing. Mounds of peppers were arranged in different hued pyramids, lined up like purses in a luxury store. But abundance was the wrong word. Lynn couldn't get over the excess. No one, she was sure, needed this much. It was obscene, and yet there was a part of her that was taken by it too. She wondered what it would be like to live that way, to be so full of sustenance that she could hardly breathe, to suffocate on extravagance. "Ready?" Phil said, sounding impatient. Lynn settled on a double pack of bread, picking up and examining a half dozen before putting them back on the shelf, trying to discern the difference between wheat and pumpernickel and multigrain. At the cash register, Lynn peeled back a 20 from the stack of fresh bills she'd exchanged at the airport. Phil looked at her and nodded, as if testing her loyalties. He handed the woman at the counter his membership card, but didn't offer to pay. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Wow. I love that scene because there's so much cultural commentary packed into this kind of brief period after arrival, and I cannot believe that Phil did not treat her to a welcome meal and instead took her to eat free samples at a mega store. But I love how you're able to convey a vision of America seen from the eyes of someone without preconceptions, as you say, without preconceptions about Detroit, who's observing the 8 lanes in the highway and the abundance and excess of this mega store. And I know you grew up in the U.S., right, for the most part. So it's my first question is really just what is the origin story for you of wanting to tell this tale of a newcomer to China, seeing China through new eyes and narrating, a country through the perspective of an outsider. And you also do the reverse with a newcomer from China coming in and seeing the US with that same kind of gaze. And what inspired you to want to write about these dual experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question, Aube. Yeah, there's a lot that sort of dates back to kind of my own upbringing and my experience. I'll say kind of explicitly about the newcomer from China coming to the U.S. I will say it's quite. I think it's quite easy to be a tourist in one's own country. I grew up in a city, in a big city, and so for me, for the first time going to school in rural Ohio was like an enormous culture shock. But even more so than that, taking a road trip out to Seattle, where I live now, was so full of awe and wonder. And it was very easy for me to see parts of the U.S. In the way that someone who's never experienced the U.S. before is viewing it, because there are just so many wide swaths of this country that are completely distinct and different from one another. So, and yeah, it just felt like such a rich experience to be able to tell. And parts of like the country in America, that also parts in China that I feel like often get overlooked, especially in contemporary literature. And I think I was really interested in fastening onto these parts of more sort of like diamonds in the rough, and wanting to like give them a little chance to, you know, be their own stars of their show for a little while. But I guess like even going back further than that, you know, I grew up as a mixed race American, grew up in America, but mixed race as well, and I have really delighted in talking with you a lot about that experience. But I think one of the things that at least happened to me was that I never felt like I had a sense of authority about anything, right? I feel like I was an outlier to Chinese culture, whether that was through my family and my relatives who all spoke Toisanese, who all looked certainly much more Chinese than I did. But also I felt like an outlier to my classmates at a predominantly Jewish high school, where I'm half Jewish, and I felt incredibly unable to access the world of synagogue and Hebrew school and all of these rituals and things that I had no familiarity with. And so as a result of that, I felt like I had this like chip on my shoulder, right? The sense that like if I'm gonna try to own this identity, I have to like go 110%. Like I have to like be like super Asian, right? For people to take me seriously as an Asian person, which isn't like necessarily the right route to go, I feel. But I think as a result of that, I was really interested in studying Mandarin, even though it's not a language that any of my relatives speak. I was really interested in going to China, although I ended up in a part of China that none of my relatives are from. But these were things that I felt like were important for me to be able to finally come to terms with my identity and kind of like figure out unlock this piece of the puzzle that suddenly everything was going to make sense. And as you may have experienced too, I think what ended up happening, of course, was that there was no clarity, there was no great epiphany, there was only more questions. There was a pervasive sense when I came to China that I certainly wasn't any more Chinese just because I happened to be living there. People still saw me with the same degree of skepticism and curiosity, and so instead, kind of from that place of questioning, I feel like that's where the writing came from. And I think there's an enormous urge, I think, for all of us when we're sort of dealing with emotions and uncertainty in our life to want to write through it, to sort of like use a creative process to make sense of an experience we don't fully understand. So I think that was really the impetus for the wanting to tell the story of two outsiders who are sort of have parts of the culture that live within them and are imbued with it as part of their experience, but they're also complete strangers to large swaths of their identity that are either absent from their own consciousness or something that's been ascribed to them by a society that they don't necessarily fully agree with.
Mm. And there's also so much to how they are being perceived in these new places they go to that kind of further informs this lack of clarity about their identity. So Liz, who's a Chinese American young woman, she arrives at the rural university campus where she and some other foreign teachers have taken up a job, and it's her and three white men, right? And she presents as Chinese ethnically, and she gets a very different response from the students or the other teachers than the three white males do. And I was interested in hearing you talk a bit more about this hierarchy almost of being foreign and entering China and occupying this role as a foreign teacher, the face of the West, delivering foreignness, and how as an Asian American, the kind of liminal space that one occupies faced with these expectations.
Totally. Well, I mean, I think your novel does such an incredible job with this. For folks who haven't read River East, River West, don't even run out. Just literally walk over and buy a copy. It's really incredible. But I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this sort of hierarchy in terms of foreignness when it comes to, sort of expat or sort of foreigner culture in China, I think is really entrenched. And I think it's a dynamic that we don't often see portrayed from the perspective of a Chinese American or someone who has Chinese identity who is occupying that space. Often we get a lot of these memoirs, right, of foreigners, let's be honest, mostly foreign men who, go and then they kind of tell their tales of, what they did. And some of them are incredibly well done. I mean, I love Peter Hessler. I really respect him and admire his work greatly. But so often I think that perspective is quite limited because it is fully this sort of like rarefied, I'm a 100% foreigner entering this space and all the kind of expectations that are caught up with that. I think as a Chinese American, it's much more nuanced, right? Because there is still some of that curiosity, there's still some of that wonder, but I think for Liz in particular, she doesn't get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to her language abilities. She never gets praised for, saying very simple phrases. She's not sort of looked at by her students as someone who kind of holds the key to Western education in the way that the other foreign men do, even though, of course, the other foreign men are often much worse at actually delivering the content in these classes. And so I think there is a very imbalance in terms of that dynamic. And I think that was kind of one of the questions that I was really curious at sort of probing, is sort of these ideas about gender dynamics, patriarchy, about expat culture, about nationality. These are things that I feel like are sort of like pervasive, and I tried to like weave throughout because there were experiences I haven't like fully been able to articulate and kind of like come to an understanding of myself.
I was really curious about this one scene with the expat teachers and Lynn, the other protagonist, who's a local Chinese woman from that area, and she starts dating or having a relationship with one of the male teachers, the foreign teachers, and at some point he and his two foreign friends, buddies who are also teachers, and Lynn all go to a restaurant together, and the three white men just squarely ignore her as this almost backdrop, like lesser than, person who doesn't even deserve being spoken to, whereas she's a student who they have come here out of, I don't know what intentions, but to teach. And I was wondering to what extent you felt that was true of the real life behavior of expat teachers you observed when you were in that setting, because expats were ill-behaved when I grew up in China in the mid to late 2000s, and I think you went there a bit later, and I would have hoped that expat teachers were just more moral characters, and your book kind of showed me the opposite. So, I know they're not a monolith, but what did you observe in that dynamic?
In some ways, like in many unfortunate realities of our current world, we have not moved as far as we would like. But I will say, I think there were different sides of that experience, certainly, for sure. But it was always an experience that was rendered, if not something that I sort of experienced myself, it was always kind of in the backdrop, this sort of sense that even when I had the opportunity to take this fellowship, in the orientation it was sort of like never date students. Like there were certain things that were sort of laid out very clearly, because it was implied that there had been instances that happened before that did not go well. And so as a matter of caution, this was the advice and really it was sort of the directive that we've been given. But of course not everyone on the fellowship necessarily took that advice, and then there were certainly people who were outside of that fellowship who certainly had no kind of their own moral, directives about what they should and shouldn't pursue. And so there were definitely some aspects of these characters that were drawn from my own relationship with other male teachers in the space, for sure. And seeing, I think, those dynamics at play was really challenging, right? Because like occupying again that sort of valence as both an outsider to both groups, but also having some affinity with both, it was a really challenging place to kind of sit where I wanted to criticize the behavior that was occurring, but also I didn't have full awareness and understanding about what it meant to sit in the shoes of a Chinese local and Chinese national and kind of what they were experiencing at the time as well. And so there was just, there were a lot of, I think, instances that that it was really difficult and challenging to kind of parse out how, what is an individual person's responsibility when they're faced with these sorts of like cultural collisions and cultural dilemmas. And I think that extends too with Liz's relationship with Lynn, even though that relationship is one that's based on at least a cursory friendship, there is still this sense of Liz coming from outside of China and sort of imposing herself on this rural town, And I think for me, I tend to believe really strongly that cultural exchange is a really positive force. You know, it's something that I feel like I'm a great advocate for and a great evangelist for. It's a part of my own experience and my journey that has shaped and advanced my life in myriad ways. It's an experience that I still think about it, and obviously obsessed enough to write a book about it, or at least a sort of fictionalized account of part of this place. But I also think there is enormous risk that's involved in that. There's a huge amount of uncertainty when it comes with bringing these elements together and not necessarily knowing that they're going to have a positive outcome. And I think oftentimes I feel like I was left with this larger question of, are we doing the right thing by having sort of more of these experiences? And I think that's something that I think Liz and Lynn, I think, both contend with as well. This kind of like chance collision that sets off their lives in really different directions that come with their own trade-offs and compromises.
And Liz is certainly someone who tries to do the right thing in her kind of brief period of overlap and encounter with Lynn. And I want to ask you about these two characters and the decision to really have them be apart for really the majority of the novel. And they don't know each other at the beginning of the book. They form a brief friendship while both on campus at this rural university, and then they kind of, it's almost like they swap places in a certain way, and they occupy these kind of parallel routes on different continents. And I read in one of your other interviews that you deliberately kind of played with their names, Liz and Lynn, only being one letter apart, and it's almost like there are different dots on a continuum or on a spectrum of, what your life could be like by accident of birth and parentage. And so how did these two characters in particular come to you, and were you trying to play with certain parallels or kind of complementary attributes that they had?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the names are confusing, right? And I think that was some of the early feedback, was like there's no way you can get away with a name that's literally one letter apart, and it's not as if there are many other letters to sort of work around. We only got 3, and 2 are the same. But I will say, I think it certainly was my intention to kind of think about these two characters as like two sides of the same coin, right? The idea of Chinese identity and Chinese diaspora is super mutable. Like the two characters can sort of pass for each other, even though they hold this like complex, rich history and background that in many ways, and really in most ways, are completely separate and apart from one another. But I think at a glance, if someone were to see the two of them, they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell apart, like parse out what those different individual experiences and identities are. And I think that's one of the things that I find really fascinating about reading and kind of writing into the space of Asian American literature, this idea that there is a whole kind of canon of work that is really like propelled and I think propagated at the outset, for amazing writers like Maxine Hong Kingston and Amy Tan, around this idea that our experiences are so immutable, right? And yet also like so separate and apart from American culture that the last thing we want to do is to render them unapproachable. And so I think people went through great lengths to translate those experiences for a Western audience, to make them really palatable, to make them really understandable, because there was this pervasive sense like we're perpetual foreigners. The last thing we want is for people to see us as continue to be outsiders. But I think more and more, that gap and that Venn diagram has, I think, gotten larger. And I'm really excited by the work that's coming out right now that's really playing with like these like sort of more minute, like sort of minutiae details. And I think that was sort of one of the things that I was thinking about too, kind of coming into the space, is wanting to render experiences that I felt like were a little bit, I think also very similar to your novel. I think occupying the space that I haven't really seen as much in contemporary literature, where you have characters who kind of embody different parts of these two identities and are sort of trying to make sense of them, while at the same time contending with outside forces that really kind of whitewash their experience or sort of put a veneer on them that renders them kind of in the same light. And so I think kind of part of the idea with Liz and Lynn was thinking about exactly that, of trying to find these two characters whose experiences in some ways mirrored one another, but that also once they were able to switch places, they felt an enormous degree of confusion, even despite the sense that they should be able to excel and persist very comfortably in their new spaces.
And I was curious how you thought about loneliness in both of these characters, because the writing is so delicate and sensorial, and there's oftentimes a kind of melancholia that seeps through these two protagonists. And Lynn in particular, she's one of her defining traits when we first meet her is she has this kind of menagerie of pets, and she cares a lot about her pets and smuggling them into her dorms, which is forbidden, and her mother just wants her to make one human friend at university, and then she kind of leaves all the animals behind when she embarks on a journey to America, which was actually like a very strangely heartbreaking moment when she lets all of them go. And of course, Liz is lonely in her own ways because of the ways she's perceived in the US, and just kind of being adrift and on a quest in China. How did you think about loneliness and connection when it came to these two characters? And they don't quite connect necessarily with each other by the end of the book, but they kind of branch out on their own separate journeys.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it was, I wrote a lot of this novel during COVID, so I would think it was easy to access those feelings of loneliness, right? I think we were all experiencing something that was a shared catastrophe, but one that was like really wholly felt individually. And in the way that these two characters are also navigating their lives during the same time, I think it was easy to imbue them with this same sense of feeling like they were maybe part of this whole, part of this larger community. But at the same time, they were sort of kind of at the mercy of what the world was throwing at them, and they were really trying desperately to stake out any kind of agency in the way that they can assert some kind of force and some amount of control to basically push their narrative in a particular direction. And I think they both sort of go through enormous lengths to try to make their desires known, even despite a world in which being able to act on them was increasingly challenging, and I think sort of remains increasingly challenging. But yeah, I mean, I think the loneliness was certainly a feeling that I had, certainly kind of like being in rural China. I mean, it was a deeply enriching experience in so many ways, but it was also full of the most kind of loneliness and isolation I've ever had in my life. And I think knowing Chinese students and older Chinese adults who have come to the US, especially to rural places, I think there's a very similar degree of isolation that's found, of not being able to find a community that can really understand and sort of make sense of their experience. And as a result, there's a sense that these two characters want to be bound to each other, they want to reach out to each other, but also there's this is enormous burden that they feel like they're enacting on the other. And so I think they're also very conscious of not wanting to make each other's lives that much worse, even though I think if they were to find each other, there might be some mutual benefit that could come from it.
I'm so interested in what you just said about the transplantation of these characters to rural places in particular. And this novel is set across so many different locales in both the US and in China, but notably when Liz and Lynn first arrive to these new countries, they are dropped into a very rural location. How did you choose these locations and the other ones that are later, more urban, or they go on road trips, but how did you choose the places, the setting of these different chapters of your book?
Yeah, it stems from an enormous lack of imagination. So I would say that first. I think so. So much of these experiences are rendered from. I feel like I've had the great opportunity to have parts of these kinds of experiences, and I think entry points into different worlds that come through a rural lens have always been really fascinating for me. Again, because I grew up in New York, in such a big city, and so I think the pervasive sense of like being able to approach a place with the kind of wide-eyed wonder that these two characters do, I don't think I would be able to capture nearly as well if it were a place like Beijing. my own entry point into China was also in a very small town that was very similar to Qixian. And so the degree to which I think Liz feels out of place in that instance wouldn't have necessarily existed if her first entry point had been Shanghai, because there is, an enormous amount of, not to say that other expats would necessarily have been her chosen community, but there is an enormous amount of all kinds of people. Whereas in this rural town, even though she may have looked very similar to a lot of the students who were at this university, she herself knew that she was very different from everyone. And I think similar to Liz, I think the experience of Lynn in the US, there's really incredible books about Chinese nationals who have gone to schools in different coasts in California or New York, and I think I just was really interested in an experience that was sort of rooted in a different kind of place, and just wanting to kind of understand what that particular dynamic would look like when you're not in a city where you can kind of find a community where you don't necessarily have to work to learn the customs and learn the language because there are people around who can support it. I think about my own family. Many of the sort of the elder generation of my family who came to the U.S. found other tourist Chinese-speaking folks in like Elmhurst and Queens and in Sunset Park, and like that's still their community, like to this day, like 6 years later. And if you're dropped in the middle of rural Ohio, you don't have that luxury, right? You really have to sort of like sink or swim and kind of like figure out how you're going to create this entire ecosystem around your personhood.
Yeah, that reminds me of the movie Minari, which I think is so effective for the exact same reason that the entry point of the immigrant family is so deeply rural. That's such great food for thought. But drastically shifting gears, I wanted to talk about the pandemic in your book. We touched a little bit upon this earlier. You mentioned you wrote this during the pandemic, and that was one of my major questions. The level of detail and precision with which you describe what life would be like in Shanghai in this case, when China is first becoming aware of a situation in Wuhan and starts sealing the buildings and enacting these very tight controls on residents. It felt like you went through it or something. It was so well described. Did you go through it? Was there a lot of research? How did you approach recreating the daily life of that period in Shanghai, China?
I live in fear of someone who had gone through the experience and calls me out on all the details that I got horribly wrong. But I did go through a quarantine, but it was in Taiwan, so it was very, very different. And then of course the pandemic changed drastically over the course of many years, stemming from a time in Shanghai when there wasn't really that much of a lockdown at all, until of course you have this big blow up in 2022. And so there's sort of been these phases that I think have that was kind of both fascinating and also challenging to write through, because you're trying to encapsulate an experience that isn't actually over. And you're writing into a space where we ourselves have no idea how this is going to end up. And so certainly, how are the characters supposed to find any kind of meaning or kind of a place of resolution coming out of this? So it was it was a process that I didn't necessarily anticipate going into. I really didn't have a sense that this novel would end up taking place during the pandemic. My initial conceit was actually to base it on a time period that was more similar to my own dates in China, which is sort of late 2000s, early 2010s. And I knew that there was going to be a quarantine aspect, because even in that time there was the swine flu, H1N1, where the campus that I was teaching at was also locked down. And so there was a really interesting dynamic that I felt where you have all of these characters who have these interpersonal dynamics, and suddenly you put them in a position where they can't leave, and they're forced to work it out with each other. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I don't really know what will happen from that. But once the real pandemic got going, it just made a lot more sense to try to take some of those issues and bring them into the present, just because it felt like there were going to be higher stakes and more urgency. So that was kind of the sort of the conceit behind it. But in terms of the execution, it was very much like a day-by-day situation, where I was still in the last semester of my MFA program, and so every couple of days, my partner and I would go on these long runs, which were like masked and with no one else in sight. And we were living in California at the time, and I would literally just turn to her and ask her, like, hey, like last week in Transplants, XYZ happened, like what's happening on this episode? And we would just like brainstorm, like, okay, like, well, what's happening in the news right now? What do you think could happen to Liz and Lynn? And like, it was fun. Like, it was really cool to just kind of try to make that organic process. And of course, you go through a lot of dead ends, right? You're like, there's some niche thing that happens where you're like, this is definitely going to be a thing, and you kind of go in that direction. Like, Lynn, for example, had, I don't know how many folks were following, like, yeah, I live in Seattle, so like there was this whole like Capitol Hill Occupy protest, the CHOP, right? And it's like, that was like a blip, right? Like in our cultural memory at this point, but at the time it was like, oh man, Lynn's gonna like run away and join this like radical group of anarchists and like start her own colony out here. And then after a couple weeks, I was like, well, actually, maybe this doesn't really feel that right. Like, let's just back that up and like try to go somewhere different. So there was a lot of like false starts and stops as part of that process. But it was also, yeah, I think also really exciting because the characters themselves were engaging with a situation that was also new and completely unknown to them. And so there was surprising elements there that also I couldn't have predicted at all from the outset.
I love your description of a collaborative running workshop with your partner. Last week on Transplants, and then you just workshop the ideas. That's so lovely.
In between episodes of Tiger King. It was a great time to be alive.
That's why he makes a campaign. No, just for me. As far as I can tell. But I have a kind of a tougher question. I would hate if someone asked me that, but I will do it to you. Politics, when you write about the U.S. and China, it's a delicate matter. It's our choices as authors, how much political commentary or judgment we want to infuse into the story. And I feel like the pandemic, as a particular lens in your book, just offered such a very subtle and yet very profound way of you to maybe kind of unfurl some political, I wouldn't even say commentary. It's just, you're not didactic, but there is the contrast of the two characters as they're navigating the early days of the pandemic in countries not their own and living through the responses of political systems that are not theirs. How did you approach weaving this political aspect into it? Did you try to avoid it? I mean, in the China section especially, we really see the effect of surveillance and tracking and kind of top-down government control, but you don't necessarily treat it with this very one-dimensional lens. And in the US, we see a lot of anti-Asian sentiment and hate crimes. So how did you approach the political when writing your novel?
Yeah, I think the discourse right now is so fascinating, right? Over like, what is the responsibility of authors to engage in politics? And I think, I think there's been really robust debate. I think like Viet Thanh Nguyen has said some really incredible things about kind of his role, and then there's been sort of backlash to that. And anyway, it's very, very fascinating. I think for me, and I appreciate you saying too about sort of like didacticism or sort of like moralizing. I feel like it's very easy to get into a mindset where you're wanting to give the reader a sense of what they should take away from the novel. And I think in the earlier drafts, it was much more heavy-handed, right? Like I think there was a sense that I was really interested in portraying the complexity and nuance of two places that are very like dear and near to my heart, in a way that not necessarily in a way to say that one was better than the other, or say that one was purely good, right, and one was purely evil. I think, and again, I took great inspiration from your work too. I think there's a pervasive sense that we, as Americans in this country, and probably many other Western countries, don't have a really full and robust sense of what it means to be kind of an average Chinese citizen today. And I think part of that is intentional, right, on the part of the mechanics that exist in our political system. Like, it's really one of the few areas where everyone on both sides of the aisle can agree on, right? It's like, as long as we're bashing China, like, we can all get along. And maybe there's just a sense of like degrees when it comes to that. But generally, we can't really engage with China as anything more than an adversary. And I was really interested in trying to subvert that dialogue and really trying to understand if we are only being told about these two hegemonic superpowers without understanding the like lived experiences of individuals who are outside of that governmental system, then how are we ever possibly going to work together to solve issues that require collaboration on a global scale? And I think the reality is like we need to work with China, like full stop. Like regardless of how you feel about their politics, it's imperative that the U.S. and China work together. And so in my experience, the only way that I've been able to understand a person or a place or a culture that I have very little experience is through the lens of people. Getting to know individuals who themselves are able to share their experiences, be able to humanize that country as a result. And so that was kind of the hope, right, was to be able to portray a more nuanced impression of a dynamic that I think gets often sensationalized in our contemporary media. But approaching the politics is really tricky because it's very easy to be moralizing. And so I think through the lens of the characters, I tried to give them a sense of both the sort of very hopeful and very positive aspects of what it meant to live in these different places, but also not shy away from the really distinct challenges and the very unique challenges that they face as a result of making those decisions to live there. So, yeah, I think there was, I think there's some risk in that, but I think, why write if you're not taking a risk, right?
Well, I think you were so successful in diving into the deeply personal and granular, and making any kind of political observation through that. I'm just going to time check. Oh, it's almost time for audience questions. I have one last one I want to squeeze in, which is language in the book. I'm a really bad sample reader because you have so many Chinese words in pinyin in this book, and I just happen to speak those languages. So for me, it was one fluid experiences. But I did sometimes wonder, okay, for someone who doesn't read Mandarin or understand, there's quite a bit of Mandarin words in the book. How did you make the decision about which words to put in, when to translate or give clues, when not to, and did it impact your editorial process at all with your publishers and editors? Did they push back? Did they have thoughts about this?
They did push back. They had lots of thoughts. And I feel like there were many areas where I was very happy to compromise. I think the language was one where I, for whatever reason, was very, very stubborn about it. Actually, my dad, he started reading the book, and he sent me this long voice message, and he's like, what am I supposed to do with these words that I don't understand? Am I supposed to go look them up every time? This seems annoying. Why would you do that? And I was like, funny you should ask that, because I have an answer. But no, I mean, I do think it sort of goes back to this kind of idea around the Asian American canon, sort of where we are now. I think the idea of writing towards a Western gaze that is on the face, not legible in these particular languages, I think is one that I was not really that interested in replicating. I was really inspired by writers like Junot Diaz. I mean, there's been many others since that have just unabashedly, unashamedly taken, in his case, Spanish words and just integrated them right into the text. No italics, no offsetting. I mean, he has a lot of footnotes, but those are completely separate and apart from that experience. And so, there's a world in which it feels oh sure, maybe I'm trying to write towards a writer who resembles my own kind of hybrid experience. But I think I also just was interested in creating a world that was true and authentic to the characters. If you have Lynn, for example, and her mom, they both lived in China their whole lives, they're not going to be talking to each other in English. So it would make sense that their text messages and that sort of the sort of intimate parts of their shared vocabulary come alive in Mandarin. And similarly, I think one of the arcs that was really only apparent to me during revision was this idea that the two, their relationships with both English and Mandarin change over the course of the narrative, as they either become more ensconced, more situated in Chinese society, or sort of move into more of an English-speaking environment. And so the way that they think, the way that they conceive, the kinds of questions that they form in their head, also fluctuates. The amount of sort of Chinese vocabulary that kind of goes in and out of those correspondences. And so that was kind of something that I was playing with too, in just the sense as we move around, as we're experiencing different things, our worlds change, and the way that we think about our worlds and the way that we engage with them on just a vernacular level also changed.
Yeah, well, it was a very lovely touch. I really enjoyed it, and I do see how it was in the Lin chapters that really there was more of that kind of bilingual integration, which feels very true to what you just said about the challenges of representing conversations that are supposed to just be in Chinese in the character's head, but there's this artifice that you're writing it in English. But how do you kind of regain some of that linguistic psychology of the character? On that note, we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. First, we'll pass on the mic.
Okay, I'll pass around the mic. Any initial questions? Anyone want to be brave and start first?
Well, I'll give the audience time to think of a question, because I have one that I feel like is always a crowd favorite that I haven't asked. Tell us all the dirty details about the publishing process of this book. How did you set about finding an agent, a publisher, an editor? What was that whole experience like?
Yeah, it was, I feel like everyone's journey is so different. I was very fortunate to find an agent relatively quickly, but we did spend a lot of time out on submission. And I think like it was challenging, right? Because we were writing about the pandemic at a time when not many people were that interested in reading about the pandemic. Like there wasn't still that like blood of pandemic literature that had come out. I think, it was like, there was sort of sensitivities, right, in the sort of US-China relationship as well. I think there, as we talked about, there was sort of like these like linguistic hurdles. A good friend of mine, Carissa Chen, just came out with her novel, which is really amazing. And, she has this like disclaimer in the front that like, it's not even simply that some of the language isn't in English, but like even the names themselves like change because there's like Taiwanese inflection and then there's like Mandarin inflection, and so it's like depending on how they're being addressed by other different characters, like we as readers have to follow that progression. And she's like, I know this is like extra work, but like I hope you'll take me up on this challenge together, right? Like I thought that was just a really like wonderful, generous thing to provide to readers, but editors maybe did not feel that way, at least in my case. But no, I mean it was like a very like weird, circuitous journey. I mean I'm very really fortunate this novel is in the world, but I think there was a very strong likelihood, there was a very strong alternative that it never would have made it, And I think something that I've learned a lot from the process is to do one's best to try to take solace and comfort in the things that one can control, which again is much easier said than done. But I do feel like fundamentally at the end of the day, the craft of writing has to, because if it isn't, everything that happens afterwards is completely unknown and under control. And so, it's such a wild trip to be here sitting with you and sitting with all of you and talking about this novel that, very, very easily could have ceased to exist. So, I just feel very, very, very fortunate.
You don't have to say it's right now and tonight, but what has been your highlight of the publication journey so far?
This tour has been so lovely, I am so like grateful to like incredible friends and bookstores and booksellers who have been like willing to take a chance on a random debut author who lives thousands of miles away across the country. And getting to meet folks who are responding to this book in different ways, right, good or bad or indifferent, they're all welcome. It's really a thrill, and so that's been the absolute highlight so far. On that note, can I actually take a photo of all of you? This is something that I have like neglected to do, and I'm sorry, this is like always so awkward. But if you don't want to be in a photo, please just like put your head between your knees or something. Just, like, you can like scowl at me if you want to. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Amazing.
Do we have any questions?
I have a question.
Oh,
Yeah.
hold on 1 second. I'll come to you.
Hi, sorry. What's your name?
Hi, good to see you, Daniel. Can you talk a little bit about what parts of the book came from your experience at the particular university where you were teaching, as opposed to other places that you traveled around in China?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conceit of the book certainly stemmed from that initial teaching experience. Like we were talking a little bit before, like I didn't really have any inclination of writing a novel. I think if someone had told me that, I would have just like laughed in their face, because I've never like aspired to write a novel. I never really had any inclination, and so I was really just interested in writing like a short story that was based in this small rural town that was sort of like an addendum to this collection of short stories that was published like 10 years ago, of which you're like maybe one of 5 people in the world who's ever read. But I think one of the constant pieces of feedback that I received from that, and also sort of my own like understanding of it over time, was that like there were all of these, like that collection was really about mixed Chinese American male studying or not studying, but living and working in rural China. And there were so many people who were outside of that experience, who were on the periphery, who never really got a chance to say their story. And I think we as writers, we have these obsessions, and I think like there's a world in which we try to like push them aside, and there's another world where we double down on them. And so I think I was like, well, I'm really like committed to this place and this experience. It still like holds a lot of personal resonance for me. I think there's still a lot more to be said about it. Again, like wanting to put these like very small towns like on the map in some particular way. Not that I feel like that's like my something that I want written on my tombstone, but like it felt important to me in this particular instance. But so that was sort of like the conceit behind it. Like I wanted to bring some of these other voices to bear, but on an experience that fundamentally was still somewhat familiar to me. Again, even though it took place like over 15 years ago at this point. So that was like the initial conceit, but really everything that happened after that was a complete mystery. I had no sense that they would ever leave the university. Spoiler, they leave the university. I had no sense like exactly what would happen in their lives, the other people that they would meet, the experiences that they would undertake. And so all of those other things kind of like came still in some parts from that experience, but like in terms of the sort of like core conceit of the book, it was mostly just those first like 4 or 5 chapters. And then there was like a great like uncertainty that I was writing into that was like thrilling and terrifying.
Was a town where you taught vinegar producing town?
It was a vinegar producing town.
Oh.
You could smell the tannins in the air. It was beautiful.
I love that detail in your book. It's not a spoiler, but it's just an example of the amazing sensorial writing in this book. Any other questions?
Hello.
So you talked a little bit about how Liz and Lynn are like opposite sides of the same coin, and maybe think about counterpoint, right? The characterization, so putting different characters together as a way of thinking about conflict, which in turn made me curious about in what way is like the attitude of these 2 women different? So how do they present differently on the page?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I mean, I think I was playing a lot with sort of these ingrained ideas of like individual collective, right? In the sense that like, Americans inherently on the face of things are like so obsessed with like individual agency, and like if you're a Chinese citizen, you are completely ensconced in sort of this larger understanding of yourself and who you are. And I think that at the outset, these 2 characters sort of like are sort of butting up against those ideas, and I think that was like sort of intentional, right? To sort of have this interplay where not only are they outsiders, but they sort of like take on this like ideological stance that is like very much in odds with the country of their birth. And that sort of like searching process, I think, is really the catalyst for their friendship. And then like sort of is the the spark that then like kind of like sets them off in various directions. But yeah, I mean, I think the ways in which their kind of like viewpoints and their understandings of the world are both like sort of very generous. Like I think they want to believe they have this like greater sense of how the world works, but like fundamentally they're also still very, very young, and they still hold these like incredible prejudices of the other, even while actively trying to refute the prejudices that are held against them. Like I mean, one instance where Lynn is, Lynn is sort of right in this weird relationship with this foreign male teacher, and Liz is really trying to like drive a wedge between them, because like she's seeing in her own experience like the weird power dynamics that are at play. But she doesn't really give Lynn the benefit of the doubt. She still sees Lynn as someone who's like this like very naive, like very young, like very effete, sort of like like sort of new to relationships, and so like even in sort of a wanting to help the other person, right, there is still like undercut with all of this like personal bias and like prejudice that we sort of like bring in. And I think that was something that was really interesting to me, because I think that's what it means to be human, right? Like even if we're trying to have good intentions, sometimes those things can go awry. And I was just very curious how that might play out for both of these characters.
Any last burning questions? No? This is a testament to Aube. You've done such a good job. There are not a million questions afterward. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight because it is a celebration. We have some bubbly over there. So there's champagne and a non-alcoholic rosé. We're going to do a signing and line up.